Institute Cooperative Broadcasting Council presents Aaron Copland, the composer as creator. Essay number 5 in the National Association of Educational Broadcasters series, The Creative Mind, produced by WGBH-FM in Boston under a grant from the Educational Television and Radio Center. These conversations explore the creative process as it pertains to the American artist and scientist in the 20th century. And here is our host and commentator for The Creative Mind, Lyman Bryson.
In the conversation with Mr. Aaron Copland, the distinguished composer, we're getting again into the region of collaboration between closely allied arts, again, music and the dance. When we were talking with Miss de Mille about dancing, we heard a good deal of the choreographer's demands upon the composer and the extent to which the choreographer could give the composer a lead into the mood and substance of which a dance should be composed. Now, Mr. Copland gives us the other point of view. Of course, as a composer, he's well aware of the fact that music is, in a sense, a very independent art, much more so than the dance. Walter Pater, in a very famous and rather hackneyed remark, said that all arts tend to move into the condition of music. I suppose what he meant by that was that as the arts get more sophisticated audiences, they tend to be less representational. They tend to deal less and less with specific, concrete things and more with general ideas and moods. And of course that's true. And music is the one art which can do that most safely and still keep its hold upon our emotions and our response. Nevertheless, this is somewhat paradoxical, music is the most cooperative of the arts, too, because music works with the dance, music works with poetry. It surrenders its own independence without any hesitation when it can help to create a combined form of beauty and power. A song without accompaniment, of course, is conceivable, but most songs are the better because of the half-perceived accompaniment that goes with them. Dancing without music is also conceivable. The virtuoso Spanish dancer will sometimes tap his foot in complicated rhythms without any music, but this is somewhat more of a stunt, I should say, than it is an art form. Usually, a dance is performed to music. Now, this may be the reason for Mr. Copland saying that the music for a dance is better if the ideas come from the choreographer and the musician works, so to speak, to order. Mr. Copland has also written for the movies. He's written for songs. He's written for television. And in all these, he says, music should not be too insistent. Music should be occasionally restrained, retiring, perhaps even complacently dull, in order to give the other art, whether it's the dancing or the acting or the words, a better chance. It may be because he's modest in this way about his own role that he's so popular a collaborator and so much sought after in writing for the dance, for television, and for the other collaborative arts. Mr. Copland insists, however, that the creative mind in this, as in everything else, is interested in the problems which are presented to him more than in anything else. Inventiveness, real creation, we might say, is stimulated by the new needs of a culture as well as by the artist's own personal experience, and in these new forms, these two kinds of demand converge upon the artist and get out of him the best that he's got. Now, in spite of all this, of course, the older forms of the arts persist. Composers still write opera and ballet. Mr. Copland is interested in opera, although he's given so much of his time to ballet. And like the others, he continues to work in these old forms because they're complex and challenging. They're always new in the problems. That is, there are new problems in the old forms. We begin our conversation with Mr. Copland when Nadja Eisenberg asks him, how does a ballet get started?
I have the idea that a great many composers even don't understand how a ballet that gets put on the stage really gets started. I think most composers imagine that they will get a dance idea themselves or get a friend of theirs to write a dance idea up in script form They then put that dance idea to music, and then they go around looking for a producer or a dance choreographer to put it on the stage. That's an illusion. In our day and time, dances, and especially ballets, do not get produced out of the mind of the composer. They get produced out of the mind of the choreographer. So that I would say every ballet that I've ever heard of has always started in the mind of the choreographer. And it's the choreographer who comes to the composer and says, I have this dance idea. It might have a story or it might not have a story. Mostly it would have some kind of story. I have this dance idea. Now I would like you to write music for it. And that's the way a ballet gets started.
Didn't you, however, write a dance symphony before it was choreographed?
I wrote a ballet from which the dance symphony came called Grogue when I was very young and innocent in the 20s when I was a student in Paris, because I had the same idea then that other people had, that you write a ballet and then somebody puts it on the stage. And I'm speaking with a certain amount from my experience. That is to say, I am speaking from my experience when I say that early ballet, Grogue, never did get produced, and I think that that was one of the reasons.
Do you think, then, that a composer has to know dance or choreography in order to compose for it?
Well, I think a composer ought to be sensitive to the translation of certain gesture elements into musical terms. In other words, there are certain composers who write a kind of absolute music, let's say a string quartet, which in its very essence may not suggest dance movement. So that I would say any good dance composer should have a natural feeling for gesture, and gesture translated into musical phraseology.
When you actually are composing for dance, how important a part does the dance play in the process of composition? That is to say, when you're composing, do you think of your music primarily, or are you at the same time envisaging the movements that are going to be set to it, the specific number of people that will be participating in it, the dynamics of the dance in addition to the dynamics of your music?
Well, that's a little difficult to generalize about. It would change a little bit with each situation. When a dancer comes to you with a script that they need music for, they generally give you some sense of what that script is going to be in dance form when it is broken down into separate sections. They don't just say, here's a script, now write the music. They will generally say, in the first 2 minutes of this ballet, we are going to introduce the characters slowly. Now, that's very important, you see. Slowly, or they might say very fast. That's very important. And we want to create a certain atmosphere in that first scene which tells you that these characters are of such and such a kind of persons, and we want a music that will bring out a sense of mystery, or will bring out a sense of activity, or will bring out a sense of religiosity. In other words, they must guide you as to the general nature of each specific scene broken down in terms of 2 and 3 minute or 5 minute or whatever it is sections. And that's the thing that you react to, and which in a sense guides you, always assuming that the composer has a natural feeling for the dance and likes to write music for the dance.
Mary Wigman said that she felt that the development of the dance theme was actually antagonistic towards being subordinated to the music, that she felt that there could not be this kind of identical simultaneous development. Have you ever composed for a choreographer actually sitting down with her and working out the music step by step so that that kind of antagonism would not take place?
No, I think what Miss Wigman says is based on a great deal of truth. That is to say, they are two different arts, so they do develop somewhat differently. But it's a problem that you would face whenever you combine music with any other art. If you combine music with a poem, the poem has a certain life that can only in a general way be reflected in the music. Dancers like Miss Wigman generally end up by creating their dance without the aid of music. And they then bring in a composer and say, this is what I've created. Now, please put music to it. No composer that I know of would prefer to work that way. I myself have never worked that way. I can conceive of working that way because it's a kind of challenge to one, to see how imaginative one can be even though one is in a kind of straitjacket, which a predetermined dance would put one in. At any rate, in my own case, when I gave Miss Graham Appalachian Spring, and when I gave Miss de Mille Rodeo, they didn't find it necessary to change things around, as I've sometimes heard is true when composers present dances with music, and they were able to adapt their essential idea to the music that I gave them.
From the composer's point of view, would you say that having another art form integrated is, in a sense, hampering intellectually, that is, that language, the language of music, has a certain meaning which is going to be distorted or confined or changed in some way by the addition of another language, a vocabulary of dance or song or poetry or whatever?
Well, I think that a composer who writes a score that is supposed to serve for dancers to dance to is working in a specific kind of genre that is different from any other genre. Therefore, he shouldn't write a music which would belong in any other genre. There is such a thing as a ballet kind of music, and if I was to say to another musician, well, that sounds like ballet music, they would know what I meant, which implies that there is such a style as a ballet style of music. Now, precisely what that style is would be a little difficult to pin down in any absolute and precise way, though we could, I think, determine some things about it.
Well, that was going to be my next question. Do compositions for dance have a common denominator musically? Do they all share something from a musical point of view?
Well, I would say they share at least this. They mustn't be over-complex. In other words, if they are so ear-filling that the audience will be distracted from what they see on the stage, then they're getting in the way of what is happening on the stage. Therefore, you will find most ballet music, like the classical music of Delibes, for example, have a rather thin contrapuntal texture, so that mostly it would depend on a long melodic line with a comparatively plain accompaniment. That is less true, of course, in our time, when we come down to the ballets of someone like Stravinsky, where the textures might be richer. But they still wouldn't be quite the same as a texture, let's say, well, like Stravinsky's most recent work, it is Canticum Sacrum, which you couldn't imagine anyone dancing to because it simply takes too much of your attention. In other words, what I'm saying is that dance music must allow for distraction on the part of the listener, distraction by the happenings on the stage, and must therefore, if it's good dance music, help the action on the stage rather than get in the way of it.
You mentioned the necessity for a melodic line. Does this melodic line in the music actually parallel a storyline in the choreography?
No, you couldn't do that. Melodies aren't that precise in their intention. I say melodic line because mostly in music it's the melody that carries everyone through, like the thread of a story. It drags you along after it. Your ear follows it all the time. It binds everything together and is the simplest thing you can be given to listen to.
Would you say that rhythm is a very important feature of music written for dance?
Yes, enormously important. A friend of mine who's a great expert on the dance, Mr. Edwin Denby, pointed out to me that it was much more amusing to watch a dancer who is not always precisely on the beat with the music than it is to watch one who always comes down right bang on the beat. And ever since he mentioned that, I've been aware, more than I was before, of the slight hesitation either before or after the beat, which helps to give the dance a kind of liveliness of its own and not just pin it on the beat of the music.
How about the influence of jazz on music for dance?
Well, in American music, I would think you'd find lots of influence of jazz, possibly not in a direct way, but certainly in an unconscious way. Jazz rhythms are now so much a part of our composers' innards that they use them without even thinking about them or specifically remembering that they derive from jazz.
You've also had experience writing music for other media, such as the movies. Would you tell us a little bit about this, what the problems are there?
Well, I think there's a definite connection between writing music for the movies and writing music for ballet, in that both are collaborative. In both cases, you are helping another art to be more expressive in its own terms, and it's not like writing a piece, therefore, which is supposed to be entirely self-sufficient on its own. It's a less grand way of writing music, let's say, but I think it's a very valuable one. I think just as we now say ballet music, and everybody understands, we assume what we mean, we now say also movie music. Unfortunately, that has a bad meaning in most people's minds, but I can visualize a time when we will say movie music and people will understand what we mean, just as when we say now ballet music, and it won't have a merely bad connotation.
You don't think, then, that music composed for these other outlets is necessarily less serious music or minor music in comparison with music composed for an orchestra?
No, I don't think it need be, by definition, more minor, but I do think that the purpose of it is somewhat controlled by the fact that it isn't all in itself all-sufficient.
Since both dance and music are similar in the sense that they can never be present completely to their audience at one time, do you think that in a sense they help each other to communicate their message when they are combined?
Well, I think the dance is more helped by music than music is by the dance. I think, for example, that an audience would be more disturbed at watching Miss Graham do Appalachian Spring without any sound than they would be at listening to the suite that I derived, or even listening to the musical score as I wrote it. That's no virtue of my own. That's simply part of the situation. The dance simply does need some kind of sound to create atmosphere, to underline gesture, to underline rhythm, and that music, when listened to by itself, suggests things to the mind of the listener so that they don't have to actually see it present, in the way that they can't hear music when they watch the dance.
What is the motivation, if we may call it that, for a composer to branch out into these other fields? Is it merely curiosity or the challenge, or is there some...
You mean these other fields, ballet and
ballet,
movies?
dance, yes, ballet, movies, radio, television.
Well, you mustn't forget that certain composers are especially gifted for the writing of such music. They can't write string quartets because they have no gift for the writing of string quartets, or they're not interested in that kind of music. And the best opera composers, of course, are the ones who are hopelessly opera composers and can't write anything but operas.
Is there a need felt on the part of a composer, though, who can write these other things to reach a wider audience?
Well, there are various reasons for writing what is, in actuality, functional music. It could all come under the heading of functional music, since it serves a function aside from its own existence as music. There are many reasons, as I say, for writing that kind of music. In the first place, people pay for the writing of it. They need it, and they're ready to pay for it. That isn't always true of string quartets. There seem to be plenty of string quartets in the world, and aside from a few patrons of music who want to see a few more string quartets created, nobody pays you to write a string quartet. So that is an incentive. Also, as you say, in the writing of a movie score, you know in advance that millions of people all over the world will hear your notes. That's a kind of stimulus that you don't get from the writing of sheerly concert music. But I think in the main, it presents a composer with a different problem. Most composers are not like Gustav Mahler, who was satisfied to write one symphony after another till they mounted up to 8, 9, and 10. They like to see what they can do in different ways. Each time you present yourself with a different problem, you're likely to come up with a different thought. And it's the stimulus of working in different kinds of media that I think is responsible for the interest of composers in writing different sorts of things.
So that these different fields actually provide you with a means of self-discovery.
Exactly. you see the same material from a different angle. It's needed for a different purpose. It suggests different solutions.
Does the music of a composer necessarily reflect his geographical background? A great number of your pieces seem to have a Western flavor, despite the fact that you were born and brought up in the East. And I wondered whether your interest in Americana, specifically Western Americana, could be expanded a little bit by you.
Well, it would take me perhaps too long a time to really give you the full background of how I happen to write music based on Western material. I connected in my own mind with the seeking in music for a kind of musical colloquialism that would seem natural to listeners in the United States. When I was a student in Paris, I was very aware of the fact that there was some connection between Debussy's music and the city of Paris, where I was living. And I always thought it would be nice if I could write a kind of music that would somehow evoke Brooklyn, where I was born. Well, it turned out that I didn't write a music evocative of Brooklyn, but I managed to write what people tell me is a music evocative of certain parts of the United States. Our interest, and when I say our, I mean our serious composers' interest in American folk material must be dated, I think, from the time that the Library of Congress began to build up archives of recordings of actual folk music performed and sung by the backwoods people. Until that time, when we only knew about folk songs as printed in books, we had a feeling that our folk material in the United States was all derived from foreign sources, since we all came from abroad at one time or another. But when we heard this same material sung and played, then it seemed to take on a character only connected with the Kentucky mountains or the far west or cowboy songs and similar material. And it was that, listening to that kind of material sung and played, not just in books, that I think gave us the idea that we could make use of that material in our more serious works. Now, the fact that I happened to write Western ballets was not of my own doing entirely. The ballet Billy the Kid was suggested to me by Lincoln Kirstein of the Ballet Caravan. The ballet Rodeo was entirely suggested by Miss de Mille, and it was only my own particular imagination set at work on those problems that brought up that kind of music. If they had never come to me asking for a Western ballet, I might never have written a ballet evocative of the West. On the other hand, before either of them came to me, I had written a piece called El Salon Mexico, which drew on Mexican materials, so that I was thinking in terms of the use of folk material to create a kind of naturalness in music that people would feel at home with.
It was possible then for you to transcend the regional difference without actually having steeped yourself in it. You could do it by research at the Library of Congress or simply imaginatively.
No, it isn't research. You don't do it by research. You do it by your imagination. You have to sort of think yourself into what it feels like to be on a prairie alone at night. And somebody said being on a prairie alone at night is very much like being in a big city alone at night when you don't know anybody in the midst of a great crowd. And I don't doubt but that's true. I mean, I could imagine myself, for instance, using a Jewish folk song, for instance, and evoking a very Hebraic atmosphere. No one happened to ask me for that, and it didn't happen to turn out that I ever wrote a Hebrew ballet, but I can conceive of such a thing being true. To put Brooklyn to music might be more difficult. In other words, you must have some kind of typical background material that people are already, for one reason or another, accustomed to thinking of in terms of a specific landscape. That's a help.
There has been a tendency, it seems to me, in contemporary dance to rely very heavily upon music that has already been written. Do you think that this is satisfactory for the dancer?
No, I definitely don't think it's satisfactory for the dancer. I can understand the temptation. A dancer wanting to choreograph an idea in their mind must be desperate until they get music. And naturally, a music already recorded must be a great comfort to work to, because there it is. You can put it on and stop it whenever you like. You don't even have to pay a dance pianist, a rehearsal pianist, so that there are many reasons for working with music already written. But I think it's a deterrent to the final result, because a choreographic idea, if it's really fresh, ought to be expressed in musical terms with a music especially designed for that choreographic idea. I think that's axiomatic. I can imagine certain exceptions. I can imagine someone doing an 18th century ballet so precisely based on 18th century forms that it would be better to use some Handel or Bach in order to get background music that goes with that. But that would be very much an exception. And I deplore the recent tendency on the part of choreographers not to commission dance scores from living composers. I understand their problems. They're expensive to get because composers have to eat, and so they must be paid when they write functional music. They must be paid each time their score is performed in public for profit. And the music they write must be copied by professional copyists, which is also expensive. So that one of the great deterrents, I suppose the choreographer would say, is the cost of ordering music, especially for their own use. But they have to pay for lots of other things when they put on ballets. I just think they're going to have to add that extra cost of the especially written score.
Do you find that there is an additional difficulty if not only dance is fitted to the music, but let us say songs or narration?
Or the reading of poetry, you mean?
Yes.
Well, anytime I think that you add one more element for the viewer to take into account, you naturally complicate the end result. And it's simpler to work with music alone. It's a little more complicated to add dance, and it's still more complicated when you add still another element. I mean, the most complicated form of all, the absolutely impossible form, is that of opera, just because there are so many different things that work at the same time. All I can say is the fact that opera includes all the known forms of music, or might include it. That is to say, you could have a chorus singing alone, you could have a chorus singing with an orchestra, you can have an orchestra alone, you can introduce ballet, you can do practically anything in an opera. Those various possibilities is the thing that fascinates composers all the time, but at the same time makes the form so hopeless in another sense. And you'll note when you read histories of music that opera was always being reformed. Every 50 years somebody came along and decided, no, those other operas before were not based on the right idea, and I'm going to show you how an opera really should be written. And I have an idea that it's an insoluble problem. Nobody's ever going to finally solve it, but that it will continue to fascinate composers to the end of time.
Aaron Copland, the composer as creator. Conversation number 5 in a series exploring the creative process as it pertains to the American artist and scientist in the 20th century. Host for The Creative Mind, Lyman Bryson. Producer for the series, Jack D. Summerfield, with William Cavness and Nadja Eisenberg as production associates. Next week, Alan Tate, the poet as creator. The Creative Mind is produced and recorded by WGBH-FM in Boston for the National Association of Educational Broadcasters under a grant from the Educational Television and Radio Center.